I'm going to talk about airports policy planning and London and how one might hope to fit what's being discussed here with this extraordinary policy into the, not just London, but in the surrounding areas' need for economic growth in the long term. And of course, inevitably, we've just heard this from Robbie, what we're talking about here is how to drive through a planning decision. But it's one that's definitely driven by commercial interests, nothing wrong with that, and driven by a perceived national interest, nothing wrong with that. But of course, it will have subnational, in this case regional, consequences. And it's those that I want to talk about, and particularly, just very briefly, 10 minutes only, to talk about the mechanisms and structures within which this all has to fit. So of course, if we're looking at the area, and there's a map in the Davis report showing the area from which the bulk of passengers, not all of them, but the bulk of passengers for London's airports come from. And of course, the Greater South East, London plus the South East plus the East region, is one of the world's greatest economic regions. It's rivaled only in terms of GDP, really, by two others. That is the New York, New Jersey 17-county region and the Tokyo, Yokohama region. There will be other cities with populations and city regions with populations much bigger, but we're talking here about 21 million people now with one of the highest GDPs and GDPs per head of any equivalent area in the world. Now, of course, within that, London does have a strategic planning capability. I mean, it comes and goes. It was abolished in 1986 and then reinstituted in 2000. So there is a London plan, and within that, of course, the boroughs have to fit their own plan. But the Greater South East, London's region, what economic geographers would see as a region, doesn't. What that has is the London plan for London, within which the boroughs must fit, and a series of unitary and district council plans for their areas. And of course, this being the Greater South East, there's never been any form of regional mechanism. It's not like the Ile-de-France, where there is a sort of regional mechanism around Paris. Nothing to do this planning in London. So what we get is what kind of comes about. And of course, Whitehall rarely steps in with area plans. British governments generally don't believe in economic planning. Now, of course, they occasionally step in with implied elements of planning. Suddenly they think a high-speed railway would be a good idea, and we will get some planning around Euston and Birmingham Curzon Street and here and there as part of that policy. The Olympics was mentioned earlier. The Olympics did involve an area-wide plan with a regeneration future, which has actually worked. Very unusual, very French in some ways, not very British, the Olympics. And that has been a form of significant area-wide planning. And of course, you get ministerial rulings on major planning decisions of the kind that were being discussed a moment ago, or implied by their willingness to accept a hybrid bill. But this is only an implied view. It's not a sort of an economic planning process. It's an implied government view about how something or an area should be developed, or a line or an airport should be developed. And of course, the Airports Commission itself was sort of a recognition of a need for some planning, and it too felt the need, and I'll come back to this, and Robbie did a moment ago, to talk about what happens as a result of building an extra runway at Heathrow. And so these are all elements of area plans, but they're not really area plans as such. Heathrow, of course, is on the boundary of London and the South East, the eastern region being, as its name suggests, to the north and east of the city. And so that means we're talking here about, at the very least, the Greater London Authority, the Mayor, Hillingdon, Hounslow, Slough, Spelthorne, Surrey County Council, that doesn't longer have planning powers of this kind quite, and of course other nearby districts as well. So if Heathrow expands, and everybody in the room knows more about this than me, I guess, there will be economic benefits nationally and locally. By locally, I mean regionally, subnationally, and similarly environmental costs nationally and locally. I'm not going to talk about the latter. This is simply a chart, cut and paste from the Airports Commission's report. Kind of doesn't really matter exactly what the numbers are. What they show are wider economic impacts of expansion in billions of pounds, and the biggest bar is the Heathrow Northwest runway, shown in various ways there, whether they're carbon traded or carbon capped, slightly different if carbon capped, but there's a big number there, potential wider economic benefit. This is beyond benefits to passengers and others. And rather more rather more simply to understand, is that the report says that Heathrow, for the North West scheme, could generate up to 78,000 jobs by 2050. Now, that would be as a result of expansion. Now, they also explain that wouldn't be quite as many jobs as would otherwise be developed anyway, so you have to see this in context. It's not that this will be additional jobs beyond a bigger number than this will anyway be generated as London's population grows very rapidly, and it is growing very rapidly by about 125,000 a year at the moment. So a big employment potential, and as it says in the report, and quoted here, the employment opportunities would be of significant value to London's growing population. It would also generate new jobs itself, of course. And several local authority areas around Heathrow will also see relative high levels of unemployment, suggesting any new jobs generated as a result of expansion would provide a welcome boost to overall employment in the area. And clearly it would. It would do this wherever the runway were located, as the report explains, but rather more so here because of the existing agglomeration effects. The report explains towards the very end of itself, it makes the point that expansion would have impacts far beyond the airport boundary, and that's absolutely self-evident. Successful delivery will require consideration of how the different work strands interact. The government should consider establishing a dedicated body to ensure the efficient delivery of a project of this technical and political complexity. So we're now back to the question of how do we plan the way not only the development and the building and the construction occur, but how does it maximise benefit for the greater southeast region and the UK as a whole, in fact, but particularly for the area nearby. And that's what we're left with, and that's my final slide, really. I'll just go through this one. I should say before I get there, this was a picture, this was in the Standard last night, seeing that the very action of publishing the report produces policies which I'm sure Heathrow had already got ready, talking about a new garden city potentially alongside Heathrow. And that just tells us that if this is all going to be done and done well, then there does need to be a way of doing it with more than Heathrow Airport Limited as the planning authority. Heathrow Airport Limited is not a planning authority, and there are such things nearby. So, as the Airport Commission suggests, some kind of dedicated, and these are my inverted commas, urban development corporation, not all of the area is actually urban, so a development corporation might have been a better thing to put in inverted commas, would be required or may be required. That's what the Commission says. My own view is that it almost certainly would be required to manage the process. And this would be, as Robbie said, a bit like the Olympic Development Authority, which is the most recent one we remember, but not unlike, in rather different circumstances, the London Docklands Development Corporation. Now, these hit very different notes with local people. The ODA was, although it had to drive through compulsory purchase and a very rapid change in Stratford railway lands in a very short time, worked with relative harmony with the boroughs, whereas the LDDC most definitely didn't in its early years. That was pushed through against the will of the local boroughs and the Greater London Council at the time. And it needs to manage not just what goes on in this extraordinary project at the airport itself, but to help with planning transport links, road management policies. There are bound to be those, I would have thought, from the mayor, and certainly the current mayor has mentioned those, housing, retail, offices, the way all of this is configured. There needs to be what architects would be fond of calling, I'm sure, a master plan, and it needs to be something that not only works for the airport, but for all the areas around it. The development will attract employment and residents to London, as the Airports Commission has suggested, and not only to London, but to Slough, Spelthorne, and a much wider surrounding area. So the question is, who should initiate this? That's the big question with anything that crosses borders in London or between London and the districts and counties just outside. Now, you might think, as the airport is actually inside, largely inside, I think some of it just overlaps the boundary, in fact, underground at least, possibly overground. The Mayor of London probably is the person to initiate this, but that would have to be done carefully. Authorities outside London may not see that as the Mayor stretching her arms and legs slightly towards the edge of beyond their current realm of control. But it would therefore need to have the full buy-in from all the other local authorities in the first instance. These things would only work successfully if it was a sort of understanding that all the authorities concerned were to be involved. Obviously, Heathrow Airport itself and other key private companies involved, there will be others, would need to have a place in this process, not necessarily on the authority if there were an authority, but very close to it as in an advisory process. And given how controversial this is, and given that in the end, those who are against development and expansion of airports, particularly at Heathrow, feel it much more sharply than all the other people who are generally on the other side against, then, and anyway, it's only fair that those who are directly affected, going back to the question about how do they do this better elsewhere, there would need to be a degree of public accountability. And actually, if that were done properly, it would actually make the whole process of developing and delivering the project that much easier. So that's it, brief canter through non-plan in London and the South East. Thank you very much.